After knitting a sweater for her husband's anniversary, Barbara puts her whole soul into this gift. But the next day, she accidentally encounters a homeless man wearing the very same sweater. Upon hearing his words, she froze. Since the morning, Barbara had been bustling around the kitchen, checking everything against the list she had prepared earlier. The reason was that her beloved Bernard was celebrating his anniversary that day. Since not many guests were expected, they decided to celebrate this occasion at home. She had thought of everything down to the smallest detail and started preparing the night before. Bernard had to buy the necessary items at the nearby supermarket that morning, so after breakfast, he went shopping. As she was making festive dishes, Barbara unexpectedly remembered how they had met. It had been almost 7 years since that day, but she clearly recalled how a handsome young man had come to her store and lingered near the window, shyly glancing at her. Berta, who worked the shift with her at the time, had laughed. "Look, seems like that guy has taken a liking to you. He's so shy, just standing there staring. Another guy would have already hit on you with some cheesy jokes." Barbara had brushed her off at the time, but she had noticed the guy. He was charming, with large brown eyes, and he could have been liked by any girl had she been bolder. That day, he didn't have the courage to approach her, and Barbara thought she must have imagined it. She assumed he was just taking his time choosing something and left without buying anything. But when he came back the next day with a huge bouquet of flowers, everything fell into place. Handing her the bouquet, he said, "You are very beautiful. May I walk you home after work?" Surprised at herself, Barbara immediately agreed. That evening, they wandered around the city talking about everything under the sun. Bernard turned out to be a pleasant conversationalist. From his story, Barbara learned that he worked for a company in the construction industry, and despite his young age, he was already the head of a department. Barbara was so lost in her memories that she didn't notice sitting down on a kitchen chair with a knife in one hand and a potato she was peeling in the other. She recalled the day when Bernard, barely a month after they met, invited her to another dinner at a restaurant and nervously handed her a small box. "Barbara, I know we don't know each other very well yet, but I'm sure. I want to spend my whole life with you, so please be my wife." At that moment, she could barely hold back the urge to throw herself into his arms because she, too, knew she had fallen head over heels for this handsome, intelligent, and modest guy. They didn't have a grand wedding, just quietly got married and started living together. At the time, it felt like they were two halves of the same whole, and their destinies seemed very similar. Barbara couldn't remember her parents. She had been raised by her grandmother. According to her, her parents were geologists, and a year after Barbara's birth, they went somewhere to the other side of the country, where a tragedy occurred. Her grandmother did everything she could to make sure Barbara wanted for nothing, while Barbara dreamed of becoming a doctor after school. But life changed in an instant. Just before graduation, Barbara came home to find an ambulance and a crying neighbor. "You're all alone now, poor thing. Your grandmother's gone," she sobbed, and Barbara stood frozen at the door, unable to believe what she was hearing and seeing. She had to give up on university. Right after school, she had to find something to live on, so she became a shop assistant. Bernard had also experienced tragedy in his life. By then, he was finishing university. His parents had been returning from a seaside trip when a truck came at them head-on. He was later told that the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. Nothing could change the fact that his parents died instantly in the accident. Barbara felt that she and Bernard had been sent to each other for salvation because neither of them had anyone left in the world. "Hey! Did you fall asleep?" Bernard's voice pulled her from her memories. Bernard stood in the kitchen doorway, bags in hand, smiling at her. She glanced at her hands and laughed. "Can you believe it? I was peeling potatoes and suddenly remembered how we met and how we lived on just potatoes after we first got married." As he unpacked the groceries, Bernard answered, seemingly lost in thought. "Yeah, those were the days. Thank God, it's all behind us. Now we can afford everything." Then, without looking her in the eye, he added, "By the way, I need to go on a business trip tomorrow. I'm not sure for how long, but I think at least a week. Barbara turned around, exclaiming, "What? How can that be? It's our anniversary today, we have guests, and tomorrow I thought we would spend time together. You said you weren't going anywhere." She didn't notice how he tried to avoid her gaze. Barely audibly, he replied, "Well, while I was at the store, they called from work and said I need to go right away." Barbara knew that sometimes he had to travel to close deals in other cities, and recently it had been happening more often, but this time it was so unexpected. Her mood was a bit spoiled, but there was no choice. She had to prepare the table for the guests. They finished the preparations together, and everything was ready by the appointed time. There weren't many guests, just a few of Bernard's colleagues, a neighbor and her husband, and Barbara's colleague, Brenda. They weren't exactly friends, but after recent events, they had become closer. The store where both of them worked had recently hired a new manager, and work had become harder. He kept implementing changes and demanding endless reports. Brenda worked in the meat department, and Barbara worked in the fish department, so they often substituted for each other and started talking. A few times, after work, Brenda had suggested going to a nearby cafe, and Barbara agreed. When Barbara mentioned she would be celebrating Bernard's anniversary, her friend unexpectedly invited herself over. "You know, I'm always home alone. I get so bored," she said sadly, and then added, "I think Bernard won't mind one more guest, especially since last time when he walked you home, we had such a good conversation." Barbara was so tired that day that she didn't even notice the overly talkative tone with which Brenda spoke. Deciding it would be awkward to refuse, she replied, "Of course, come over, why not?" When all the guests had arrived and were sitting at the table, Barbara, taking a glass and looking at her husband, said, "I hope no one minds if, as a loving wife, I speak first." At that moment, a gift bag appeared in her hands, and she pulled out a beautiful sweater she had knitted herself. She had spent almost a month secretly from her husband, finding time in the evenings to make this wonder. The item turned out to be even better than the one in the magazine, where Barbara had found the knitting pattern. "Here," she said, handing over the gift, "I think this sweater holds all my love, all the warmth of my soul." After kissing her husband, she added, "And I really hope it will warm you up in any bad weather and remind you of me." Her husband, kissing her back, extended a glass of champagne. "Oh, stop, I always remember you." This time, however, he didn't say that he loved her, as he usually did. Barbara didn't think much of it, assuming the birthday boy was just nervous after her congratulations. The evening went quietly and warmly. Everyone tried the treats, praised the hostess, congratulated the birthday boy, joked, and danced. Meanwhile, when Bernard's colleagues invited Brenda to dance a few times, she jokingly replied, "Hope you're not offended, but I promised myself that either I won't dance at all, or only with the birthday boy." Barbara was so worried about making sure no one went hungry that she didn't pay attention to anything else. She just wanted the anniversary to go as smoothly as possible. So, all she did was clear dirty dishes and bring whatever was missing. When everything was over, her husband went to see off the guests, and Barbara, sighing with relief, began to clean up. When Bernard returned, she hugged him. "Well, did you enjoy it?" He flinched, as if not expecting her touch, and somewhat distantly said, "Yes, it was good." "You were, as always, on top of everything." Taking his hands off her shoulders, he added, "If you don't mind, I'm going to bed. I have to go on a business trip tomorrow." He went to the bedroom, and Barbara continued cleaning up for another hour. In the morning, as soon as the alarm clock rang and Bernard was in the shower, she quickly made breakfast. When Bernard sat down at the table, she gently said, "Please wear the sweater on your business trip. I knitted it with love, and it will keep you warm and remind you of home." Her husband nodded in response and, to her delight, really did come out of the room wearing the new sweater. After sending him off, Barbara got ready and left for work. Usually, she was fine with her husband's trips, but this time she felt uneasy, as though something was going to happen. Trying to push these thoughts away, she finally arrived at her workplace. Brenda was already behind the counter and, strangely enough, looked at Barbara with a smug expression before asking, "So, did you see off your beloved on his business trip?" Barbara found her tone unpleasant and decided to respond simply, "Yes, I did. Shall we get to work?" At that moment, Barbara thought to herself that this wasn't the first time Brenda seemed to be jealous. But she quickly got back to work and forgot about it completely. It was Friday, and the store was busy, with the manager walking through the shop every hour. The time passed quickly, and when Barbara was about to leave for lunch, a loud voice from the security guard near the checkout counter caught her attention. "Hey, get out of here. This isn't a charity, we don't give handouts. You've got arms and legs, you should be working, but no, it's easier to beg." Looking toward the commotion, Barbara couldn't believe her eyes. The strong security guard was yelling at a scrawny man, holding him by the collar of the same sweater her husband had worn that morning. The sweater, which she could never mistake for anything else. The one knitted with love and care. The homeless man, with his dirty, bearded face and ragged pants and shoes, clearly didn't belong in such a sweater. He was trying to break free from the security guard's strong grip, but it was useless. In a daze, Barbara found herself at the checkout counter. Gently pushing the security guard's hand aside, she quietly said, "Why are you yelling at him? Maybe he's sick and that's why he can't work. Everyone needs food. Let him go, he's leaving." With a slight nudge to the stranger's shoulder, Barbara led him toward the exit. Once outside, she took her wallet from her pocket, counted out some bills, and handed them to him. "Take this. I hope it's enough for food." The man hesitated, but Barbara insisted and placed the money into his hand. Then she asked, "So, where did you get this sweater?" The homeless man looked at her in surprise, then at his clothes, and gestured toward the trash bins behind the store. "Over there. I found it today." The woman from the next apartment, a painted blonde, threw it in the trash before entering the store. "I picked it up." Barbara immediately knew who he was talking about because there was only one blonde working the shift that day, Brenda. Stunned, she suddenly recalled the previous evening when her friend had tried to get Bernard to dance almost every slow dance, whispering flirtatiously in his ear, after which they both laughed. Brenda had even volunteered to walk him home despite living just a couple of houses away and being gone for quite some time. At the anniversary party, Barbara had brushed it off, caught up in the festivities. But now, an unpleasant picture was forming in her mind. It seemed that her husband hadn't gone on any business trip at all. In the sweater knitted with love, he was heading toward Brenda. Barbara, turning sharply, quickly made her way to the shop floor and headed straight for Brenda's department. "Bernard, is it you? Are you lovers?" she asked quietly, hoping that Brenda would deny her suspicions. Her friend, however, smirked and immediately responded defiantly. "Well, great that you figured it out yourself. I won't have to lie or hide anymore." At that moment, a stern voice came from behind Barbara. "I don't quite understand. Have you forgotten which department you should be in?" It was clear that these words were directed at her, and Barbara decided not to start a scandal with the lover to avoid making her already precarious position worse. Since the new boss had come, he had picked a victim in each shift and meticulously looked for reasons to punish anyone he disliked. For some reason, Barbara had become the unlucky one during her shifts. Every time the boss appeared on the floor, he would head straight for her department, and rarely would he leave satisfied. He was always unhappy with something about her work, always irritated, while Brenda always had it worse and treated customers rudely. And this time, he didn't even notice that Brenda didn't have half of the price tags, or that the products on the shelf were in a heap, like a garbage pile. Instead, he immediately attacked Barbara. To avoid further angering her boss, Barbara quickly retreated to her department and tried not to get in his way for the rest of the day. The shift passed as if in a dream. Barbara mentally pictured how her husband was lying in bed with Brenda. Tears of hurt choked her, but she kept herself together, occasionally casting angry glances toward the department where Brenda was working. By the end of the day, Barbara had decided that she had to talk to her, though she still didn't quite know what the conversation would be about. When the workday ended, Barbara caught up with her lover on her way out of the store. "Wait, let's talk," she said, grabbing Brenda's arm. Brenda sharply pulled her wrist away. "Go to hell." Brenda immediately got into a taxi that had pulled up, and Barbara was left standing, humiliated. The whole evening, Barbara tried calling Bernard, but his phone was turned off. Time and time again, she called, hoping to talk to him about everything, but he remained unreachable. Barbara didn't sleep all night, only dozing off for an hour before the alarm went off. When she got up, she mechanically got ready for work, skipping breakfast. She felt completely down. There was a sense of foreboding in her heart, as though something else was about to happen, even though, in her mind, she thought the worst had already happened. She had been betrayed, cheated on, her soul had been spat on and crushed. She wanted to leave everything behind and run away, hide, disappear, but instead, she went to the very job she hated. To her surprise, Brenda, who usually arrived late, was already there. She was chatting playfully with the boss, adjusting her hair, and he was watching her like a hawk. Barbara was always amazed at how easily Brenda could charm men. Even this boss, who had seemed so harsh and stern at first, now practically melted whenever she appeared, forgiving all her mistakes. Noticing Barbara, Brenda said something quietly to the boss, and he immediately turned and walked toward her. His face was so fierce that Barbara felt a chill in her soul. "You're here, good. Stay here," he hissed, leaving a frightened Barbara standing right in the middle of the floor. In just a couple of minutes, the entire supermarket staff was gathered. Looking at Barbara with a burning gaze, the boss started speaking. "I've gathered you here before we open to give you some important information. There's a thief among us. I'm almost 100% sure who it is. But just to be certain, I'll conduct an unscheduled inventory check at the end of the shift today." He looked at Barbara as if accusing her of being the thief, although she had never stolen anything in her life. In fact, she often would have given her last possession away if she saw someone else needed it more. "I warn you," the boss continued, even more threateningly, "whoever is found responsible for any shortage will be thrown out without severance pay." Although Barbara was sure that everything was fine in her department, she couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered throughout the day. Meanwhile, Brenda kept smiling strangely at her whenever their eyes met, but Barbara dismissed her smirks as relating to her and Bernard. After the store closed, the inventory took place, and Barbara was stunned when, out of the entire supermarket, her department was found to be missing several very expensive items. "What, did you want some caviar?" the boss yelled, spitting all over the place, and then for about 10 minutes, he scolded her in front of the whole staff, calling her a thief and an ungrateful brat. He then said, "Get out of here if you don't want me to call the police. Your salary won't cover the entire debt, so write a note promising to pay it back soon. Otherwise, you'll be looking at a checkered sky." He then announced in front of everyone that Brenda was being promoted to head of the sales department for her good performance, though he didn't explain what that performance was. As Barbara left, tears in her eyes, she caught another smug glance from her former friend, who was clearly celebrating her victory. At that moment, Barbara felt a rush of heat. She remembered how, shortly before the anniversary, Bernard had asked her to cover for him for a couple of hours. While the boss wasn't around, Barbara had decided to leave to deal with an unexplained outstanding bill for the apartment. Her friend had lamented at the time, "You need to clear things up right away, or later, when you pay, you won't be able to get your money back. Go ahead, I'll cover for you in your department while you're gone." As Barbara walked home, she kept replaying the situation with the missing items in her mind. When she got to her apartment, she was almost sure that Brenda had stolen the expensive caviar to set her up, but proving anything now was impossible. She cried for hours, repeatedly trying to call Bernard, but his phone was still off. Barbara was in a panic, not knowing what to do next. Bernard left for his lover, he was fired from work, and they even hung a substantial debt on him. It seemed like her calm, well-ordered life had collapsed in an instant, and there was no way out of the situation. Not understanding what she was doing, Barbara suddenly got up from the couch, as if in a dream, threw a shawl over her shoulders, and went outside. She didn't know where she was going or why, but as soon as she found herself on the bridge over the only river in their city, it hit her. The only solution she saw was to end this nightmare right there, right then. Approaching the railing, Barbara stood for a few minutes, staring at the water below. Tears fell down, seemingly marking the line she was about to cross. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder and yanked her sharply away from the railing. "Are you out of your mind?" a man said indignantly, and Barbara, in the evening twilight, recognized him as the homeless man who had come to the store wearing her husband's sweater. As if afraid to let go of her shoulders, he continued to scold her seriously. What could possibly happen in life that would make a young, beautiful woman do something so reckless? There's no problem in the world that can't be solved. What happened to you? Without expecting it, Barbara suddenly started crying and told him everything. About her husband's betrayal, about how she was set up at work, the firing, and the debt. The homeless man listened silently, then calmly said, "Well, is life really over because of that? So what if your husband is a jerk and found someone else? No one's ever died from that. Look at me, I'm still alive, and it's fine." Barbara looked at him in surprise, and the man smiled sadly. "What, did you think only men leave women? Sometimes it's the other way around." Then, taking Barbara's hand, he suggested, "Let's take a walk along the promenade. That always helps me clear my head." As they walked, they got to know each other. The man's name was Daniel, and he was only a few years older than Barbara. It turned out he used to be quite a successful businessman until his friend and business partner betrayed him. In an instant, he lost everything he had worked for. With a slight wink, he added, "And this, you know, Barbara, is not a box of caviar, the theft of which you've been accused of, but rather a pretty successful business and quite a lot of money." Barbara liked this simple and, as it turned out, very interesting man. She could see how painful it was for him to talk about it, so she quietly asked, "And where is this friend now? Why did you give up on everything so easily? And what about the police?" Daniel said that his friend had planned everything well in advance, and because of him, he even ended up behind bars. Picking up a stone from the ground, the homeless man threw it with all his might into the water and added sadly, "I wanted to sort things out when I got out, but who's going to listen to a former convict? I went to visit my friend the same day I met you. The store director is that scoundrel." Barbara, as if not believing what she had just heard, asked again, "Mr. Chandler is the same partner and friend? Oh, I see. He's no longer Edward, but Mr. Chandler," he said with a smirk. "Yes, the very same Chandler. He didn't even recognize me when I went to see him." They walked in silence for a few more minutes, and then Daniel suddenly looked at her in a strange way, as though seeking support, and quietly said, "I, of course, would like to get back at that bastard, take back everything he illegally took, but that's not the main thing." At that moment, Barbara saw so much pain in his eyes that her heart tightened. Daniel continued, "That bastard took the most valuable thing from me. Edward sent my son to an orphanage, and now only he knows where he is. I've searched everywhere, but you understand, in my current situation, it's not easy to get any information." Barbara felt sorry for him, but she didn't know how she could help. As they talked, she realized that her problems seemed so much smaller compared to Daniel's. When she got home, she was in a completely different mood. Bernard still hadn't shown up, which was immediately obvious. She quickly grabbed all the money from the jewelry box, money she had saved, hoping to go on vacation with him in a couple of months. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a small apartment. Opening the internet, Barbara spent the rest of the evening searching for a place to live, and in the morning, after calling several numbers, she found an affordable one on the outskirts. After packing her things, she sent a spiteful text message to her husband, informing him of her departure and her intention to divorce as soon as possible. At that moment, she really hoped he would read it quickly, and that everything would finally be over. When she arrived at her new place, she noted that for such a low price, the apartment was quite decent. The furniture was probably older than Barbara herself, but everything was in good condition. The old embroidered tablecloth and a stack of cushions on the bed in one of the rooms suggested that a grandmother had lived there recently. Barbara's assumption was confirmed when the young girl, handing her the keys, said, "This was my grandmother's apartment. She passed away almost a year ago. I was thinking of moving in here myself, but I can't at the moment. I live with my parents, and my father is very ill, so they need my help." After the owner left, Barbara unpacked her things and went to the bus station. She remembered that Daniel had said he often worked there, helping people carry their luggage. Almost immediately, Barbara saw him, recognizing him by the same knitted sweater. He saw her too, waved his hand, and walked toward her. "You? I thought we would never meet again. Although, I must admit, I thought about you constantly." At that moment, he looked at her with such an expression that Barbara shyly looked away. Then, as if remembering why she had come, she quickly started speaking. "Daniel, I left my husband and rented an apartment. It's on the outskirts, but quite decent. We're going there now, and you can stay in the second room for now. Then we'll figure out how to help you find your son." At first, the homeless man strongly refused. But after a moment of thought, he said, "Listen, maybe it would be easier to solve both my problems and yours together. And as soon as I earn some money, I'll pay you back for the apartment." That evening, sitting in the small kitchen, they spent a long time making plans for their future. They searched for job ads online on the old laptop that Barbara had taken when leaving her husband. As they were getting ready for bed, Daniel quietly said, "Barbara, you're such a kind, amazing woman. Thank you for taking me in. I hope I can repay you someday." At that moment, Barbara's heart skipped a beat. There was something about this man that made her not want to part with him, not even for one night or for a few hours. Just a few days ago, she thought her life was over and almost jumped off the bridge, but now she was ready to help this homeless man with everything, just to keep him from disappearing. The next morning, Barbara woke up to a delicious smell coming from the kitchen. Throwing on her robe, she went out and was surprised by what she saw. There were 2 plates on the table, each with a perfectly cooked fried egg, with the yolk intact. It was exactly the way Barbara loved it. Smiling, she said, "I can't stand it when eggs are fried carelessly, mixing the yolk with the whites. You seem to know exactly how I like it. Look how beautifully you made this." Daniel turned around and, smiling, replied, "Good morning. Because I like things to be neat too. It seems we have a lot in common." Barbara didn't know what to say because she already understood that herself. After breakfast, they went through the job listings, and when they were almost losing hope, they got hired at a vegetable market. An elderly man named Jonathan asked them a lot of questions about who they were, where they were from, what they could do, and then sighed. "I'll take you. My loader's been drinking, he's been a pain, and the saleswoman got married and is staying home to cook for her husband. But listen carefully, one mistake and you'll be back out on the street." Daniel and Barbara nodded in unison, almost not daring to believe their luck. And the next morning, they were at work bright and early. Daniel helped the owner unload goods and loaded them into customers' cars, but he always found time to help Barbara, constantly saying, "Don't try to lift anything heavy, call me and I'll help you." He said it so sincerely that Barbara wanted to feel fragile and defenseless, pressing herself to his chest, unwilling to let go. Every time such thoughts crossed her mind, she pushed them away, trying to distract herself. But the longer they spent together, the more Barbara noticed that Daniel seemed to care for her not only at work but also at home. And this care was becoming more than just friendly. The first money Daniel earned, he immediately gave to her. "This is for helping me and believing in me." No matter how much Barbara protested, he wouldn't listen. "Now, every day, as soon as I get paid by Jonathan, I'll give you a part. You're the one who owns the place, so you can decide how to spend it." Barbara often caught herself thinking that this was the kind of husband she had always wanted. He was nothing like Bernard, who always tried to divide household duties into male and female, although it seemed his views had changed by now. A few times, Bernard and Brenda came to the market, and Barbara tried to lift her scarf as high as possible to hide her face. In general, the couple looked quite happy, but her ex-husband now resembled a servant beside the queen. Brenda walked through the market, bargaining with almost every vendor, but only buying the most expensive things. It was obvious that they had money because every time they came to the market, their purchases amounted to half of Barbara's monthly salary. While Bernard and Brenda walked through the rows, Barbara tried to avoid them as much as possible. When they finally left, Barbara couldn't hold back her tears. It seemed that she had already come to terms with the betrayal of her friend and husband, but every time they appeared, the hurt would overwhelm her again. One of those days, Daniel rushed in as always to help restock the shelves, and when he saw her tears, he tried to find out the cause. "I can't forgive these traitors. My heart is breaking," Barbara said quietly. Unexpectedly, Daniel approached her, hugged her tightly, stroked her head, and said, "Yes, I know what betrayal feels like and how hard it is to get through it, but you need to try to erase the past and start a new life. And I'll always be here. No one will ever hurt you." At that moment, Barbara felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wanted to stand there and listen to the steady beating of this man's heart. She lifted her face and gently kissed his cheek. "Thank you so much. I don't even know what I'd do without you." "And I without you," Daniel replied, smiling, and kissed her back. A couple of hours before the end of the shift, he rushed in a few more times to warn her that he'd be late. They had received a truckload of goods, and they needed to unload it quickly. When Barbara returned home, she decided to make dinner and wait for Daniel. She felt like this evening would change their lives. But Daniel didn't show up, not after an hour, nor 2, nor 3. It had been raining outside all evening, and the drops running down the window looked like the tears Barbara was barely holding back. She knew Daniel was a completely free man who owed her nothing, but she couldn't believe that he could just leave her like that, without reason. Daniel never came, and Barbara, barely making it through the night, went to the market the next morning. The gates were still closed, but the security guard, recognizing her, let her in. From him, Barbara learned that they had been unloading the truck until almost 5 a.m. After that, the workers, drenched to the bone, had stayed to sleep in a construction trailer. It seemed like everything was cleared up, but Barbara's heart still ached. She immediately went to the place the security guard had pointed out, knocked softly, and entered. 2 men were drinking tea at a makeshift wooden table, looking at her in surprise. Then, from somewhere deep inside, there came either a sigh or a groan. A pile of blankets shifted on the floor under the window. One of the men poured hot water into a cup and went over to the pile. The other man, looking sadly at Barbara, spoke. "He got sick, got wet in the rain, worked yesterday. We can't take him to the doctor, he doesn't have any papers." Barbara rushed toward the source of the groan. Throwing the blanket aside, she saw Daniel. He was lying pale with his eyes closed, his face covered in sweat. Barbara took his hand in hers. "Daniel, look at me. Why didn't you come home? I'll call a taxi and we'll go. You're burning up. You need a doctor." With great difficulty, he opened his eyes and whispered, "You shouldn't have come. I'm not going anywhere. I don't want to be a burden to you. You've already done so much for me. No, go, leave me here. I'll just lie down. You're young and beautiful. You'll find yourself a decent man. Why do you need me? Worthless, and now I'm sick too." He closed his eyes, and Barbara saw tears forming in small droplets down his cheeks. Without saying a word, she suddenly stood up and rushed toward the owner. Jonathan was already in the stall, and without letting him react, she quickly started speaking. "Jonathan, dear, can you cover for me for half a day? Daniel is sick. I need to take him home, get him some medicine." The owner looked at her angrily. "What's wrong with my workers? You haven't even worked yet, and you're asking to leave." At that moment, Barbara, unexpectedly from herself, snapped. What were you thinking when you made him unload the truck in the pouring rain without a coat? No rubber boots, no raincoat, and it was raining like crazy. Now he has a fever, needs a doctor and medicine, and you're upset?" Saying this, she didn't think her boss could fire her instantly, but his reaction was completely unexpected. He reached into his wallet, counted a few bills, and handed them to Barbara, deliberately not looking her in the eye. "Here, buy him some medicine, go. But be back by lunch, I need to go for the goods." Barbara, thanking him for the money, immediately ran back, calling a taxi on the way. Daniel tried to resist, but she didn't listen. The men in the trailer helped her get him to the taxi, and half an hour later, they were home. For the first time, Barbara was happy the rented apartment was on the ground floor because Daniel was so weak that even getting to the first floor was a struggle. The next week, she was torn between work and caring for Daniel, who was still sick. She fed him with a spoon, gave him medicine, and even gave him injections. For the first 5 days, the illness wouldn't budge, and she thought about calling a private doctor, since the local clinic required papers Daniel didn't have. But one morning, she woke up to sounds coming from the kitchen. Quietly opening the door, she could hardly believe what she saw. Daniel was putting the kettle on the stove, holding onto the nearby chair for support. Hearing her steps, he turned around and, smiling, said, "Good morning. I decided to make some tea, really wanted it with your jam." That morning, Barbara felt the happiest she had in a long time. Her Daniel was healthy again, smiling like he used to, scooping spoonfuls of strawberry jam. He was ready to go back to work that very day, but she firmly said, "Are you out of your mind? You can barely stand on your feet. You'll be in bed for at least a couple more days, and I'll handle things with Jonathan. By the way, he turned out to be quite decent and even feels bad that you almost died because of him." For the next few days, every time Barbara came home from work, dinner was already set. Daniel, almost apologizing, would say, "Well, at least I'm good for something. Here I am, already healthy, but you're still not letting me go." One evening, Barbara barely stepped into the apartment before jumping back. Coming toward her from the room was an older man in glasses, limping on his right leg. Only when he spoke did Barbara recognize the stranger as Daniel. "How do I look?" he said, laughing. "While I was sitting here, I decided to pay a visit to my former partner. I've got a plan. What do you think? Do you think he'll recognize me?" Barbara was confused. "He didn't even recognize you without the makeup and limp, so he definitely won't guess now." Daniel didn't reveal his plan to her, saying he first had to try to execute it. The next day, he left the house at the same time as her but didn't head to the market. Instead, he went toward a shop. Barbara couldn't relax all day, worrying about him. But when she came home, she saw his happy smile. 10 minutes later, from an emotional recount of the story, Daniel told her that his boss hadn't recognized him and had hired him as a janitor without asking for any questions or documents. "Can you imagine? I'm limping, dragging my leg," he said excitedly, like a child. "I begged him to hire me, saying I couldn't find any work because of the car accident I was in, caused by a drunk driver. And he, the fool, didn't even ask for any documents." They spent the evening discussing the plan for how Daniel would gather information about his son. He was almost certain that all the secrets his former partner kept were locked in a safe in the shop. When Barbara asked why he was so sure, Daniel shrugged. "Back when we worked together, he used to keep lists of mistresses in the safe. He never took anything home. All the secrets stayed locked up at work." Unable to stop herself, Barbara asked, "But the safe is locked with a key. How are you going to open it?" Daniel, no longer limping, walked into the hallway and returned a minute later with a bundle of keys. "What are lockpicks for, then?" After meeting with his future boss, Daniel stopped by the market and, as a favor, got this tool. Barbara didn't like the idea of breaking into the safe, but she understood that Daniel was doing it only to find his son. Every day now, he went to work at the store, diligently playing the role of a limping invalid, while Barbara covered for him at the market. A few days later, she received a call and was told that Daniel was in the police station asking for a visit. It was a shock for her because he had left for the store that morning as usual and was supposed to return by evening. Not understanding what was going on, Barbara went to the station. As soon as Daniel was brought in, the first thing she asked was, "What happened? Did he recognize you?" "No," he replied and continued, "I waited for the boss to leave, then I got to the safe. I found information about Edwin and something else. But I didn't anticipate that Edward had gotten smarter and connected an alarm to the safe." Daniel took her hand and kissed it. When he returned her hand, Barbara felt that something was in it. Casually glancing at the guard, she understood that he either didn't notice or was pretending. She quickly hid her hand under the table and kept it there for the rest of the visit. When the meeting ended, Barbara went outside, and the first thing she did was unfold a small piece of paper. It contained the name of a neighboring city where, apparently, the orphanage where Daniel's son had been sent was located. A little further down, it said, "Train station, locker 100, code 232348. She stood for several minutes, rereading the message. Then she went to the bus stop for the station. She still didn't understand why Daniel had given her this information, but she knew it wasn't for no reason. When she opened the locker, she was very surprised. Inside was a hefty folder with documents. Her curiosity got the best of her, but she decided to take the find home first and look through it there. On the way back, her mind was a complete jumble. Barbara didn't yet know how she would get Daniel out, but she was determined to try. The moment she stepped inside her new home, still in her shoes, she sat on the chair and, with trembling hands, opened the folder. One by one, she went through the documents, which included pictures of people known throughout the city. It turned out that her former boss had been collecting compromising material on them, presumably to use for blackmail and profit. Not knowing what to do with it, Barbara kept rereading the contents of the folder. She stayed up all night, contemplating what to do with the secrets she had uncovered, but by morning, a plan had begun to form. It was impossible to make an appointment with everyone listed in the files, so she chose just one person, who would then certainly inform the others. She came to this conclusion after seeing a photo of the entire group at a sauna together. The next morning, she made copies of several documents from the compromising material and left the folder at home, heading to meet the head of the administration, who was the most frequently mentioned person in the folder. The distinguished man in a sharp suit listened to her attentively and, at first, almost kicked her out of his office. But after seeing the documentary proof of her words, he paused for a moment, then sternly asked, "What do you want in exchange?" "Oh, nothing much," Barbara shrugged and said, "You will punish the one who's been digging against you and help free an innocent man and restore his good name." The head didn't agree immediately. As if still not fully believing, he said, "All right, I'll contact everyone you mentioned today, and by evening, they'll get in touch with you." Barbara went home in a daze, unsure whether the head had taken her seriously or if he just wanted to get rid of her quickly. But the next day, she received a call. They said they were ready to accept her offer. The folder was delivered directly to her home by the head security guard, and within a few hours, Daniel was home. As soon as he stepped through the door, he picked Barbara up, kissed her passionately, and said, "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I'd probably still be there. You're amazing." They spent their first night together. And Barbara, holding Daniel tightly as he slept, felt the happiest she had ever been. When she woke up and didn't find him beside her, she got scared. Throwing on her robe, she rushed to the kitchen, but Daniel wasn't there either. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she didn't know what to think, but at that moment, the front door opened, and there he was, standing on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. Noticing her confused look, he embraced her. "What's wrong? Why do you look so scared?" "I woke up and didn't find you," Barbara whispered, pressing herself to his chest. He laughed and kissed her. "How could I leave you now?" he said, handing her the bouquet, taking her hand, and looking her straight in the eyes. "I know I'm not quite the ideal catch yet, but I promise things will change soon. And so, I ask you, Will you be my wife?" Barbara felt like everything happening around her was some beautiful dream, and Daniel kept looking at her, as if afraid she would refuse. Buried in his chest, she whispered her agreement and burst into tears like a girl. She didn't care whether he was rich or poor, whether they had money or not. She understood that she loved this man with all her heart and soul. The next day, they submitted their application for marriage. Fortunately, Barbara had already managed to divorce Bernard. And the first thing Daniel said that day was, "As soon as we get married, we'll go to your son and start gathering the papers to get him back. As a married couple, they'll definitely give him to us." At that moment, she saw so much love and gratitude in his eyes that tears welled up in hers. By then, she had almost forgotten about the meeting with the head and the dreaded folder, because the most important thing was that Daniel was free. But a few days before their wedding, he received a call from the police. "It's strange, I thought they closed my case on breaking into Edward's office," he said, surprised. After going to the investigator, Daniel didn't return for a long time. Barbara couldn't find peace, and she suddenly became scared. She couldn't imagine her life without him. That day, Barbara had a day off, so she tried to distract herself by doing household chores, but everything seemed to be falling out of her hands. When a few hours passed, and Barbara was ready to go search for Daniel, she heard the front door slam. He literally rushed into the room. "Barbara, you can't even imagine what happened. Edward, it turns out, was arrested, and your friend was fired without severance pay. Some inspection found out they were selling counterfeit goods, and when they cornered my former partner, he confessed that he had framed me once." He lifted Barbara in his arms and, spinning her around the room, joyfully continued, "I'm clean, exonerated. Exonerated, do you understand? I am innocent." Putting her down, he immediately added, "Can you imagine, the investigators said they found too much on Edward. But regarding my case, he immediately stated that the business would be returned to me soon." Daniel also told her that he was given the location of his son. It was a closed orphanage, hardly mentioned anywhere. "Shall we go tomorrow?" Barbara suggested, "and we'll find everything out there." She was eager to get the boy as soon as possible since it was very important to Daniel. The next day, when Daniel saw his son, he cried without trying to hide his tears, and the boy, wrapping his arms around his father's neck, didn't want to let him go. They, along with Barbara, took the list of necessary documents to take Edwin and began preparing everything that very day. Days flew by. Barbara continued to work at the market, and Daniel switched to another employer, working every other day. In his free time, he worked on his son's paperwork and transferred the business to his name. A few times, Bernard approached Barbara, and she immediately sensed something was off. Her ex-husband looked lost and unkempt. He begged for forgiveness, swore his love, and said he couldn't live without her. But Barbara sharply interrupted him. "It seems you've chosen your path and your woman, so live with her and leave me alone." "But you don't understand, she's not mine, this Brenda," Bernard said, as if justifying himself. "I have nothing in common with her, not like with you." Looking at Barbara with pleading eyes, he added, "She only cares about money. She doesn't know how to cook or take care of the household. All she thinks about is salons, fitness, and shopping. Please, forgive me, will you? Come back." But Barbara was unyielding. She felt nothing but pity for him now and would never want to return to her former life. She had already made her decision. Barbara eagerly awaited the long-awaited day of their marriage. There was no talk of a grand wedding. They simply arrived at the designated time to sign the papers, and after exchanging rings, they left as a legal husband and wife. But Barbara didn't want any pomp. Even if there had been a possibility, she would have still married Daniel just this way. They were happy together, and that was the most important thing. But right after the marriage registration, Daniel squinted slyly. "Now we're going to a restaurant. Jonathan reserved a table for us and wouldn't hear of any refusals. He said it was a wedding gift from him, and I also have a gift for you, but I'll tell you about it there." Barbara smiled. "I think I also have a gift for you." The restaurant turned out to be very cozy, with a welcoming staff. The table was set for two. Barbara was once again surprised that, no matter how tough Jonathan seemed as a boss, he was actually a kind and generous person. When Daniel began filling their glasses with wine, she covered her glass with her hand. "I can't, I'll have some water instead." A flash of fear appeared in her husband's eyes, but she immediately smiled and reassured him. "It's fine, it's just that this is the gift I wanted to tell you about. We're going to have a baby, a little boy or girl." For a moment, Daniel silently stared at her, then took her hands in his and began to kiss them. "My dear, my love, my best, my only, my unique, you're my angel, you're my happiness." When the first emotions settled a bit, Daniel pulled a document out of the inner pocket of his jacket and, handing it to Barbara, said, "This is my gift. The business is mine again, or rather, ours. So I've made you the owner of 50%, so now you are the full owner of the supermarket where we first met." Barbara covered her husband's hand with hers and softly said, "I don't need any wealth, I just need you." A week after that day, Barbara and Daniel, both anxious and nervous, approached the orphanage to pick up Edwin. The boy, waiting for them at the window, joyfully waved, and as soon as they entered, he rushed, for some reason, not to Daniel, but to Barbara. Throwing his little arms around her neck, he hesitantly asked, "Will you be my mom? You won't leave me, will you?" A lump formed in her throat, preventing her from responding immediately. She stood, stroking the boy's light hair, while tears flowed down her cheeks. Kneeling, Barbara looked into his eyes. "I will never, never leave you. You're the best son in the world." The boy hugged her around the neck. "And you're the best." Daniel, who had been silently watching, finally decided to intervene. "What about me? Don't you remember me? I, by the way, love you both very much." He stepped closer, hugging them both, and softly said, "So, shall we go home, my dear ones?" At that moment, Barbara felt that she had finally become the happiest. These two men, so alike, were now her world, her life, her happiness.